Hi everybody! Thanks for joining us for the third video of the February series live stream. Today we're going to go over two different things. We're going to go over motivating operations and the different types, and then we're going to go over shaping. This is just going to be like a fairly introductory video to those topics. Both of those topics you can sort of really dive into and incorporate the topics we've gone over in past videos with them, but we're just going to focus on doing the introductory level stuff and sort of taking it a step at a time to make sure that the concepts are clear and understood. So thanks for joining us. My name's Becca. I'm the person behind Shadowed Behavior. I know I say this at the start of all my videos, but I want to make it really clear that before anybody ever starts any behavioral procedures, you always need to check for any medical issues first. So if your horse is acting a certain way, get them vetted before you start behavioral manipulation of any kind. So the two things that I said we're going to focus on today are MOs and shaping. Again, these two things aren't necessarily things that go hand in hand, but I feel like this is a good point to start sort of talking about them and moving forward with them. So an MO stands for motivating operation. So it can either increase the motivation or decrease motivation depending on what it is. So what happens a lot of the time is that people get motivating operations confused with discriminative stimuli, which is something that we went over in our last video, which just sort of signals that reinforcement is available, punishment is available, or neither is available, depending on what kind of discriminative stimulus it is. If you guys are confused about that or you want more info, you can always check out the last video we posted, which is the second video from the February live series. But so motivating operations, don't signal the availability of reinforcement. They tend to alter the value or the behavior related to the reinforcement. So motivating operations have two different types. So you can either have, as you can see on the board behind me, you can either have EOs or AOs. So an EO is an establishing operation and an AO is an abolishing operation. And they're exactly what they sound like. So an EO makes you want it more and an AO makes you not want it so much. So the way that I like to remember this and the way that I like to give examples is sort of if you're in school and let's say you're in middle school and you have the late lunch. So school starts at like 7:30 in the morning and you get lunch at 1:30. So it's been like a solid 6 hours since you've had any food. You're going to be very hungry. If your teacher who you had right before lunch period was going to try to get you guys involved in like a little like group activity or group quiz and they gave out pieces of candy for right answers, your responding would most likely be much higher than it would be if there was no candy involved. So the motivating operation there would be technically hunger or lack of food. So that leads us into our next thing too, which for EOs versus AOs, you're looking at deprivation versus satiation. I always mix that word up. Oh my gosh. But so when you deprive somebody of something, they tend to want it more. So if you have a horse who gets fed at 5 p.m. and then doesn't get fed again until 9 o'clock in the morning, they're going to be dying for that food, and you're probably going to see a higher frequency or a higher rate of behaviors depending on the fact that they're hungry. So essentially, hunger would be an excellent motivating operation. Now, the difference between a motivating operation in that example and an SD is they're hungry and they can, that's going to be their motivating operation, but they don't know that reinforcement is available until they see the food cart rolling down the aisleway, essentially. So the SD would be the food cart, and the motivating operation would be deprivation of food for X amount of time. Again, this is not something that you ever want to fight ethics on, so you shouldn't really be depriving anything or anybody of food for too long or of water essentially at all. Some people do for experiments, but even then. And then the other one that we're going to look into, so those are for establishing operations, are abolishing operations. So if we jump back to that first example of the teacher giving out candy after class or after every correct answer for this quiz that he's trying to get higher participation from the students in, and he does it right before lunch, he's going to see a really high rate because they're hungry, so they've been deprived of food for X amount of time. Versus if he does it after lunch, so if he has a period right after lunch and he tries to do it with them, they're going to be satiated on food. They will have just eaten. They're not going to really that reinforcement's not going to have high value to them because they just had access to it. So that would be an abolishing operation, is being satiated on something. So another example would be if you were grounded, all you would want to do most of the time would be go out with your friends. Like the day that you're not grounded, you're going to go out and see your friends because you've been deprived of seeing your friends for X amount of time, versus if you were just with your friends for 3 sleepovers in a row, you might be more than ready to come home. That would be an example of an abolishing operation because you've been satiated on seeing your friends. So those are like the main core concepts that you really want to look into when you're using MOs. But how can we apply this to horses, right? So we gave the grain example, but how can you make your horse really want to work for something and really have like a high rate of behavior if you're trying to train new skills? We're going to use the example of training new skills here because ideally for EOs and AOs, you would want to be, you're using reinforcers. So it's discussing the effectiveness of a reinforcer. So you're going to be looking at whether or not you're reinforcing a desirable behavior. And ideally you wouldn't be reinforcing a behavior that's not desirable. So if you're trying to teach your horse a new trick, for example, one day when I was like much younger, I decided to teach my horse the trick to smile by waving my finger at him. And we're going to use this example in our next topic, which is shaping as well. But when I taught it to him, I got there super early before they fed breakfast, and I used really small pieces of treats to give him each time that he performed the response that I was looking for. And this way, one, he was deprived of food from over the night. I mean, like, obviously they fed him the night before, but he was starting to get fairly hungry. So there was deprivation. And then I kept the treats of the food fairly small, enough that he enjoyed them, of course, but I'm not giving him like handfuls upon handfuls upon handfuls of food for the correct response because one, I wanted to see a high frequency of this, so I wanted to practice it a lot. And two, if I was giving him all of that reinforcement for every response, he would quickly become satiated on it and it would actually turn into almost an abolishing operation. He wouldn't really want it that much after a while. So I kept the pieces small. I actually used Fruit Loops, but and just worked with teaching him to smile by waving my finger. So that would be an example of an establishing operation. That being said, horses are extraordinarily food-oriented animals, and that is something that I tend to prefer in the horses that I work with because it is so easy to get them to do X, Y, and Z if they're that motivated by food, that even if I decided to come and do this after they had fed him or after he had been grazing all day or after whatever, he would probably still be so taken with the idea of treats that he would still perform all of these new things that I was asking of him without an issue. In fact, one of the main treats that I tend to use is hay stretcher because it's just hay. And the last thing I want to do, depending on the horse that I'm working with, is cause a medical issue like too many treats, too much sugar intake, X, Y, or Z, whatever the issue may be. I just want to make sure that I'm giving them something that's generally good for them. And the majority of horses I work with love hay stretcher. So it works out really well. Anyway, so going back to that example of me teaching Shadow to smile, I used a bunch of shaping procedures. So in order to understand this, we have to go over what shaping is. And then if you can see on the board behind me, we're going to go over what DR and SA stand for. My field loves quadrants and abbreviating things. So we're going to break those down. So shaping is essentially reinforcing or differentially reinforcing successive approximations of terminal behavior. So that sounds so fancy, guys, but what it really is just, did you catch the letters, the abbreviations? Differentially reinforcing is the DR, successive approximations is the SA. So differential reinforcement is something that we have not gone over yet. But essentially what you're looking at doing when you differentially reinforce is exactly what it sounds. You're going to reinforce certain things and put other things on extinction. So differentially reinforcing certain behaviors, ideally of the same response class, and then you're going to reinforce the successive approximations of the terminal behavior. So successive approximations are behaviors that get closer and closer and closer to that end goal behavior that you sort of have in your head. That's what you would be looking for. Horses are like dogs in the food aspect for sure. Sorry, I'm just seeing these comments. Deprivation could be a good way to train your horse, but like I said, I mean, they're so food oriented that it probably wouldn't even be necessary depending on the kind of horse you have and what their feeding program is. But for going back to shaping and differentially reinforcing, so we said that giving reinforcement to certain behaviors and putting other behaviors on extinction, and then SA would be the successive approximations. So you're looking to identify the steps of the behavior getting closer and closer to that goal behavior that you have, that behavior in your head that you want. So my goal for the horse that I was working with, my horse Shadow, which is why it's named Shadowed Behavior, was for him to smile. So ideally what I had envisioned, for lack of a better term, was when I wiggle my finger, he should stick his head up and stick up his lip, and that would be his smile trick. So what I started with doing was shaping that behavior. So I'm going to differentially reinforce the specific behaviors I want. So when I differentially reinforce successive approximations, I'm going to reinforce the closest behavior I can get in that trial to the terminal behavior. So first I started with him sticking his head up. So I wanted him to bring his head up. That behavior was reinforced. He got a treat for that. Then I wanted him to stick his head up a little more. That behavior was reinforced. So the second you move on to the next further step, you put the previous behavior on extinction. So originally it was him just sticking his head up a little bit. That was being reinforced. The second that he stuck his head up higher, the sticking his head up a little bit was put on extinction, and the sticking his head up higher was being reinforced. From there, I worked with different kinds of cues to get him to stick his lip up, but then it became sort of to the point of, okay, so just sticking your head up's not enough. You have to stick your lip up now too. And once he started sticking his lip up, just putting his head up was put on extinction, and we moved forward from there. So let's jump back a smidge here and go over an example of how I ended up using different schedules of reinforcement. So schedules of reinforcement is something that we went over last session. So there are the 4 schedules. So we're looking at fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval, and variable ratio. I posted that diagram earlier this week. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, take a look at that video, take a look at that diagram that was posted, save it if you need it. There's also examples of the graphing that you can look at. So when I'm shaping a behavior, for every successive approximation, for every step closer, I'm going to use an FR1. So an FR1 is just another way of saying continuous reinforcement, right? So every ideal step towards that behavior is going to be reinforced. You want to keep reinforcing that one behavior. So that would be your FR1, continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is the best schedule of reinforcement for shaping new behaviors and shaping new skills, because you want them to move in that direction. You want to make that a pleasurable experience for them. Once they have the behavior and you're attempting to maintain it, what you're looking to do is have an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. Intermittent schedule of reinforcement could mean almost anything. Most of the time you're looking at either variable ratio or variable interval. Every now and then you might see fixed ratio, but that's, I mean, technically it could be intermittent depending on how many, or fixed interval, again, depending on how many, but the more variable it is, the better rate of response you tend to have. In fact, the best schedule to see the highest rate of responding is variable ratio. So variable meaning on average and ratio meaning amount of responses. So on average, X amount of responses gets reinforcement. I will say that Shadow has seen me as an SD and constantly has an MO for wanting treats. So he performs this behavior all the time, to the point that I had to teach him a new thing, which is wait. I had to teach him the word wait, where he has to back up one step and sort of turn his head away from me, because he would just get so in your face about treats that it was a little ridiculous. But these are all sorts of things that you want to take into consideration. So MOs and shaping are things that you want to take into consideration when you start working with horses and attempting to teach them new skills. Depending on the horse you work with, I know my horse Shadow would just do anything for a treat, so I'm not super concerned with finding that motivating operation, because I know that it can be the treats. But for shaping, you definitely want to focus in on and do some research if you're planning on teaching a horse a new behavior, to make sure that you are appropriately and accurately differentially reinforcing successive approximations of the terminal behavior, the end goal behavior that you have in your head. Shaping can be really difficult, and it's very subtle, but also very quick. So you want to give that reinforcement as soon as possible. You want them to associate the correct response with that reinforcer. So the second that he stuck his head up a little bit, I gave him the treat right away. In fact, I gave it to him from my hand all the way up here because I wanted that behavior exactly to be the one getting reinforced. I didn't want the behavior of him technically bringing his head back down to get a treat to be reinforced. I wanted the behavior of his head up to be reinforced. So this was a short one, guys. Wow, we blew through that stuff. I'm going to run through a few examples over some things that we did in the last couple of sessions just to keep us sharp and fresh. But otherwise, unless anybody else has any questions, we're probably going to wrap up. I know. I'm sad about it too. This was I love talking about this stuff if you can't tell. But, okay, so we gave the example of different schedules of reinforcement that we went over, which was excellent. Going back to the first one, we can talk about the different consequences. Oh, sorry, we have a question here. Let me just read this. So it says, if your horse is clearly food motivated, should you modify your regular feed schedule at all, timing in or quantity while you are working on shaping behavior to make up for the food they are getting through training? Or should you maintain their feed schedule and have any treats they are getting through training? I wouldn't change your horse's feed schedule for anything. As long as it's a good one. I mean, each horse they're very like routine animals, like creatures of habit. So I would definitely try to keep their feed schedule the same. That being said, like there are some horses who just don't like treats. You can always use hay, but ideally you wouldn't want to cut back on their main supply food in order to give them treats. The treats you should be giving them should be so small to a 1,200-pound animal that it shouldn't really be a huge dietary impact. If you're working with a horse who you're trying to really train up and you're doing a lot of clicker training or you're doing a lot of positive reinforcement training and you're giving a lot of treats in short amount of time, try to find something that goes with their natural diet. So I know some people do give pieces of hay, some people do give pieces of minerals, or some people I use hay structure, which is literally just hay, and horses definitely think that they're treats, at least the ones that I've run into. So those are the ones that I would look into. That was definitely a good question. I wouldn't worry too much about changing your horse's feed schedule around, just because the less that you whack with your horse's gut, the better off they tend to be. I always tell my students that horses are these big, strong, powerful animals that are just made of glass and paper. They tear and break so easily. They're very fragile. But moving forward, so we can talk about the different consequences, and ideally what you're looking to do with differential reinforcement, sort of tying this back to today and what we went over today, is that you're going to combine concepts of positive reinforcement where you add a stimulus that would ideally increase the future frequency or intensity of a behavior, right? So that's our example and that's our definition of positive reinforcement. Most of the time people tend to focus on the frequency. When it comes to shaping a behavior, you're looking at the intensity. So you're literally going to be running what's called a DRH procedure, which is a differential reinforcement of higher frequency or intensity of a behavior. So essentially what you're seeing is you're reinforcing, to give it this kind of example, is you're going to be reinforcing the extinction burst. So your horse wants the treat in your hand and you have them stick their head up and you give them a treat and they're like, awesome, I stick my head up, I get a treat. And they do it again to the same level and they're like, I'm not getting a treat. So they stick it up higher. Then you reinforce that. That was technically a very mild and minimal extinction burst. And then from there, they stick their head up higher and you work with it even more and you train up that new skill of, oh, I have to stick my lip up. So then they learn to put their head up and stick their lip up, and it's moving forward at that sort of speed and that sort of pace, and combining the combination there of positive reinforcement, so giving them that preferred stimuli, and also extinction, where you're withholding reinforcement from a behavior that was previously reinforced. Differential reinforcement has so many levels, and shaping has so many different things that we can definitely dive into going forward. Just for a few examples, like just to name a few, this isn't even all of them, you can do differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, which is a DRA. You could do a differential reinforcement of other behaviors, which is a DRO. You could do differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, which I like a lot in theory, but it can be really hard to use in practice, which would be a DRI. And then you have DRL, which is low frequency or intensity, or DRH, which is high frequency or intensity. And those are the main types, but then there's also, which I still have to study too, because there's so many concepts in applied behavior analysis that there's no way that I personally can know them all. And I'm sure a lot of other people, I have the whale, my big giant 3rd edition Cooper book, literally it was open next to me and I was referring to it before I even started this, because there's so many concepts and I want to make sure I'm giving you guys the right information. It wouldn't be really ideal if I went on a Facebook Live and then told you guys all the wrong info. So just moving forward, like, they can do differential reinforcement on different schedules of reinforcement and different schedules of consequences, and they can use X, Y, and Z and whatever they need in order to accomplish these goals. And moving forward, it's just really interesting to look into. So we're going to keep trucking. That's just about all I had for today, guys. Thanks for those of you that joined us. I think this was the shortest video yet, and it's still over 20 minutes. Jeez. But if you guys have any other questions, feel free to comment them now. Send us a message. Send us an email, shadowedbehavior@gmail.com. You can go to our website, shadowedbehavior.com. Feel free to find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. We are always here, and we are very excited to talk to you about horses or behavior or both, which is our favorite. So if you guys don't need anything else, I'm going to take off. But make sure to join us next week and like the Facebook page and subscribe on YouTube and follow on Instagram. Next week, we're going to be going over the one that I've been looking forward to the most, which is keep these in your back pocket, terms for things you already do every day, and just sort of be aware of how you as an equestrian or you as a human are constantly both being used through behavior analysis, and how behavior analysis can change how you act and how you use it on other people or other animals without even knowing. So that's it for today. So have a good day, guys. Thanks for joining us.